I remember it too well, that camping trip up in the Cascades. The kind of remote, backwoods stretch where trail maps turn into wild guesses. And if you go deep enough, the only signs of life are the occasional crackling of branches and the rustle of some hidden creature. My buddy Theo and I had been planning this for ages. We wanted pure, untouched wilderness, far beyond the reach of cell towers or park rangers. So, after a day's hike through thick, ancient pines and moss-covered stones, we found ourselves far from any kind of marked trail, the surrounding forest dark and thick as night closed in around us. It was the third night when things started going wrong. We'd set up our small tent in a narrow clearing, the kind that barely fit the two of us. By that point, our bodies ached from climbing over logs, brushing off spider webs, and hauling our packs up a steep, uneven trail. After making a small fire, we settled in, grateful for the light, though it barely seemed to push back against the surrounding shadows. The air was silent and thick, the forest almost oppressive in its stillness. I remember thinking it was strange. No insects, no birds, just this suffocating quiet. Very soon we fell asleep. A couple of hours later, I was woken up by some noise. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Some kind of animal, maybe an elk or a mountain cat. It was eerie, but not enough to pull me fully awake. I closed my eyes, trying to shake it off. And then it came again, this time closer. It was like a cry, but stretched out, somewhere between human and animal, rising and falling in pitch. There was a strange, almost hollow quality to it, like something immense and ancient calling through the trees. Theo stirred next to me. He must have heard it too, because he whispered, "Did you hear that?" We both sat in silence, straining to hear through the heavy quiet. The fire had long since died down to embers, and the night was a solid, endless black around us. And then, out of nowhere, a branch snapped just beyond the tent. The sound was sharp, clear, and far too close. It wasn't the careless movement of a wandering animal. It was deliberate. I could feel my heart start to pound, a creeping coldness spreading through my chest. Theo and I exchanged a glance in the dark, our faces barely visible in the faint glow of the remaining embers. He mouthed something I couldn't make out, his expression one of rising panic. Another snap, and then another, coming closer with each step, as if something was pacing around the perimeter of our tent. We listened, barely daring to breathe. The thing outside circled slowly, a heavy, deliberate shuffle, like it was trying to stay quiet but was just too massive to completely avoid making noise. The air inside the tent felt stifling, thick with fear. Every nerve in my body was taut, like I was waiting for the inevitable, the moment it would find a way inside. He was standing right next to the tent and we could hear his breathing. Theo made a strangled noise and pressed a hand over his mouth. Neither of us dared to look. I could feel the presence outside, a looming, oppressive weight pressing against the thin nylon fabric separating us from whatever was out there. Its breathing was slow and rhythmic, like it was taking us in, assessing us. I didn't want to admit it, but there was something oddly intelligent in its movements, a kind of self-awareness I'd never felt from an animal before. Suddenly, the tent shifted, something heavy pressing into it, that a claw or hand slid across the fabric. Theo's breathing hitched, and a sharp, loud intake of breath escaped him before he could stop it. Suddenly, the tent shifted, something heavy pressing into it. A claw or hand slid across the fabric. Theo's breathing hitched, and a sharp, loud intake of breath escaped him before he could stop it. In an instant, the thing outside lunged at the tent with a guttural roar that vibrated through my bones. The whole structure crumpled inward as a massive shape bore down on it, crushing one side and pushing us back against the ground. I caught a glimpse through the thin, stretched fabric. A hand, if you could even call it that. It was massive, covered in coarse, matted hair, with fingers too long, ending in thick, filthy claws that scraped against the nylon with an ear-splitting noise. And the smell, an overpowering stench of wet fur, rot, and something else. The creature's face loomed into view, pressing against the fabric near my head. Its eyes were dark, and its mouth was too wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. I could see each yellowed tooth clearly, its lips curled back in a snarl. It was like a twisted, exaggerated version of a human face, and yet entirely wrong, almost feral. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest thing, a flashlight, and swung it toward the creature, flicking it on and shining the beam directly into its face. For a second, it flinched, recoiling as if the light burned, but it didn't back away. Instead, it let out another snarl, one so low and guttural that I felt it vibrate through my entire body. Its shoulders alone seemed broader than the tent itself, and its arms, long, almost gangly but thick with muscles, hung at odd angles. Patches of its fur were matted, covered in what looked like dirt and fragments of leaves. And its eyes, those eyes were almost human, intelligent and watchful, filled with a mix of curiosity and malice. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it echoing in my ears, drowning out everything else. Theo snapped out of his frozen shock and started to crawl out of the other side of the tent. I was right behind him, not daring to look back as we fumbled our way out, pulling ourselves over the torn tent fabric and stumbling to our feet. The creature was still behind us, its hulking form now fully visible as it straightened to its full height, easily towering over us. It let out a sound, almost like a warning, a deep, rolling growl that seemed to rumble from somewhere deep in its chest. We bolted, crashing through the trees, branches slapping against our faces as we ran. The forest floor was uneven, full of rocks and tangled roots that threatened to trip us at every step. Behind us, I could hear it following, the heavy thud of its footsteps echoing through the darkness, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. I didn't dare to look back, the fear of seeing it gaining on us too overwhelming. Then the ground gave way beneath me. I slipped, my foot catching on a root, and I tumbled forward, landing hard on my hands and knees. Theo stopped, his eyes wide with terror as he looked back at me. He wanted to keep running, to leave me if he had to. I shouted at him, desperate, go, just go. But instead, he grabbed my arm, yanking me up just as the creature's shadow loomed over us again. We took off, running even faster, my leg aching but fueled by sheer adrenaline. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized the sounds were growing fainter. The creature was no longer right behind us, but I knew it was still out there, watching, tracking us in the shadows. Finally, we stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed, gasping for breath. The silence around us was thick, as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. I strained to hear, listening for any sign of it. A twig snapping, a low growl, anything. But there was only the sound of our ragged breathing and the faint rustle of leaves. And then, a heavy crack echoed just behind us, followed by that familiar, low growl, closer than ever. My heart froze. It was here. Somehow it had tracked us down through the forest. Theo's eyes met mine, wide with terror, and without another word, we sprang to our feet and started running again, dodging trees and jumping over roots in a desperate, blind sprint. In our panic, we must have taken different paths through the trees, the darkness swallowing up the sight of Theo just a few steps ahead. Branches scratched at my face, the air filled with the sound of pounding footsteps. Mine and, somewhere close behind, those of the creature. I called out to Theo, hoping to hear him answer, but all I could hear was the creature's heavy breaths, its pace quickening. Suddenly, I realized it was no longer behind me. The creature had gone after him. I heard my friend scream, and then silence. I don't know what happened, but I didn't have the strength to run anymore. I covered myself with a lot of leaves to disguise myself and just listened to the forest. For hours, there was nothing. Only the eerie silence of the forest settling around me, thick and unnerving. I'd lost all sense of time as I crouched there in the underbrush, heart pounding, listening for any hint of Theo, any sound at all. But there was nothing, not a single voice, not a rustle of footsteps, only the occasional distant creak of the trees swaying in the wind. I wanted to call out, to scream his name, but fear held me back, choking my voice. By now, I wasn't sure he'd even survived. Then, the silence shattered. From somewhere nearby, branches began to snap, the heavy crunching sound unmistakable. My heart raced, dread prickling up my spine as I realized it was coming closer, each step deliberate and weighty. I pressed myself deeper into the undergrowth, barely breathing, hoping that the thick foliage would hide me well enough. The creature moved slowly, almost methodically, its massive form visible in fragments through the leaves. Its head turned side to side, as though scanning for something, maybe for me. I didn't know what it had done to Theo, but I feared the worst. There was no way he could have outrun something like that. I held my breath, fighting every instinct to move, to somehow shrink further into the ground. My only hope was that it wouldn't see me, wouldn't catch my scent, or worse, step too close and crush me under its weight. I could see its huge, matted feet now, one slow step at a time, its sharp claws glinting faintly in the moonlight that broke through the trees. It was so close I could smell that thick, rotting stench again, nearly unbearable, making my stomach twist. Every muscle in my body was tense, waiting, praying it would keep moving and pass by without noticing me. Finally, it passed by, lumbering deeper into the trees until its heavy steps faded into the distance. Relief flooded over me, but it was mixed with a deep, paralyzing dread. I lay there, heart hammering, terrified to even think. Every sound around me felt amplified. The rustle of leaves, the groan of distant branches, the faint skittering of small animals in the underbrush. My instincts screamed to stay hidden, to wait no matter how long it took. And even if I'd wanted to go, I didn't have a flashlight. It was just me, the darkness, and a single cheap lighter clutched in my shaking hand. The lighter's tiny, unreliable flame was no match for the forest at night. I knew I couldn't risk wandering blindly. One wrong step, one stray noise, and the creature could be. The weight of the night pressed in all around me, thick and suffocating, and I felt as though the shadows themselves were watching, waiting for any movement. So, I lay there in the dirt, hardly daring to breathe, listening to the sounds of the night shift around me. I knew my only option was to wait it out until dawn, hoping that morning light would bring some measure of safety. Every creak of a branch or whisper of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me, but I forced myself to stay still, staring into the blackness, counting the seconds, praying for the first hint of daylight to break through the trees. As the first light finally began to filter through the trees, I felt my whole body relax just slightly, a flicker of hope sparking within me. The forest, once so dark and impenetrable, slowly revealed itself in muted grays and greens. I knew this was my chance to make it out, so I rose slowly from my hiding spot, every nerve on high alert as I moved quietly through the underbrush, retracing the trail we had taken into this nightmare. After about half an hour of creeping through the forest, I suddenly, hearing a strange rustling behind me. It was fast and erratic, almost like footsteps, crashing through branches and leaves. Fear and excitement overwhelmed me. I knew that something was coming and it was right next to me. I saw a shadow waving its hands. It was Theo. He looked wild, his clothes torn and scratched, his face covered in dirt and small cuts from the branches he must have barreled through. Relief and disbelief hit me in equal measure as he stumbled forward, grabbing my shoulders with shaking hands. His eyes were wide and haunted, but he was alive. I lost it by running through a river. When it followed me, I realized it was slower in water, so I stayed in until it finally backed off. His quick thinking had saved him, and now, finally, we had a chance to get out of this place. We leaned on each other for support, our legs shaky but determined as we navigated through the forest. With the morning light above, we managed to pick up bits of our trail, guiding us back in the direction we had come from, further and further away from where we'd seen those enormous tracks. Hours later, when we finally broke through the tree line and reached the trailhead, we collapsed, utterly exhausted but safe. Neither of us spoke as we looked back at the silent, towering trees. The forest seemed peaceful in the daylight, almost like it was hiding any sign of the creature we'd encountered, concealing whatever mysteries it held in its depths. Did we see the Yeti and survive? This night was simply terrible, but who will believe that it is true? The main is that got out of this cursed forest and everything is behind you. Even after we made it out of the forest, the experience stayed with us. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see flashes of those dark, intelligent eyes, hear the low growl reverberating through the trees. I tried to push it away, chalk it up to some vivid nightmare, something I could forget with time. But for both Theo and me, the memory only grew sharper, more haunting, as the days went by. We barely spoke about it in the weeks that followed. There were so many questions we didn't dare ask each other. What had it wanted? Why did it follow us? And, most chilling of all, had it let us leave on purpose? But over time, the creature slipped from our lives, leaving only memories, strange as they were. The fear that had once been so paralyzing began to loosen its grip. What had haunted our thoughts started to settle into something different. A story we could look back on without the terror creeping back in. The memory of the Yeti became something we talked about in rare moments, sometimes over a couple of beers or while recounting old stories around a campfire. In time, we began to laugh about it, turning those shaky whispers of that dark night into tales of courage. We'd share the story with friends, glossing over the moments of panic, letting our fear fade into something else entirely: pride. They'd call us brave, survivors who'd seen what few would believe, and each time we recounted it, I could feel a strange sense of heroism building inside. It became something we carried with us, a reminder of the night we faced down the unknown and made it out. Theo and I often hiked other trails together, more cautious now but somehow braver, knowing we'd faced something beyond reason and survived. The fear had transformed into a kind of strength, and in some strange way, that night in the woods had made us feel alive.